what was it like to be the representative of Switzerland in Washington, D.C.?
Okay. Well, I was twice in the United States. The first time in the early 1990s when I was in our delegation to the United Nations covering the first committee that is dealing with peace and security. At that time, I was a disarmament and security policy expert. And then more recently, in 2014, I have been nominated to become the Swiss ambassador to the United States. And this was, of course, a very exciting time. A lot of things happened in the United States. When I started, I presented my credentials still to President Obama. And then 2 years later, there were the exciting 2016 elections. I followed very closely, and then a new administration. So this was to some extent the background or something about the administration I was working with. Regarding my own work, it was a quite comfortable work because we have since a long time, good relations with the United States. This goes far back in the last century, and even before the Swiss Constitution has been drafted against the model of the US Constitution. President Wilson was decisive for the League of Nations to come to Geneva. Without President Wilson, there would not be an international Geneva. And so we don't have, or we never really had tensions. There were ups and downs. The core of our relations are economic relations. Switzerland is number 7 investor in the United States. This is surprising given the size of the Swiss economy, and a lot of those investments are in very interesting areas with a lot of research and also with very high average salaries. So it was to some extent one of my role to promote this. We could also start exploratory talks about the free trade agreement. What is better known than those elements is our protective power mandates we have for the United States. When I arrived in 2014, there was still the mandate for Cuba. This came to an end in summer 2015. It was for me very exciting to follow this whole process, and then to see the Cuban embassy in Washington opening, and the person who was before somehow somebody working for me becoming the new Cuban ambassador in Washington, D.C. But more important and more difficult, of course, is the protective power mandate of Switzerland in Iran. Those countries have, as you know, really bad relations. This cannot be compared to Cuba. And so every day something was going on. I cannot come up with all the details, but I was very happy when we had the release of the American prisoners, and we had a big event afterwards when they came back to the United States. So this was one of many highlights. And of course, the United States is not only Washington, it's a whole country, almost a continent. And I enjoyed very much to travel across the United States to speak to people and to interact and to discover many parts of this country I didn't know before.
Yeah, very exciting career. And I remember seeing you at the Security Council, I believe was 2002, 2003, when I was at the UN in New York. You presented several times to the Security Council. You were involved with the negotiations or disarmament issues, right? So yes. You could that. Can you tell us a bit now your involvement also in the issues of disarmament?
Yes, I mean, at that time, I was the director of the Geneva Center for Humanitarian Demining. And demining or working in mined areas is a very important topic for the United States, for the United Nations, and in particular for the peacekeeping operations. And so as an expert in humanitarian demining, running operations, running research programs, I was invited then by the UN to give briefings about the risk for peacekeeping troops in mined areas. This was in 2000, in a time when there were much more victims than today, and when to some extent many of the peacekeeping operations were hampered given the heavy mining that has taken place during the active combat time. Think, for instance, of former Yugoslavia, but also of other places.
And now you are involved also with cybersecurity issues, because this is a big item in the agenda of the United Nations coming forward. As you know, the Security Council for the first time brought the discussion to the table. So what is your involvement with, you are on the board of a civil society organization. Can you tell us a little bit what's in coming forward, going forward?
So my background is security policy, and I'm not, let's say, a cyber specialist. But if you look at today's security threats, you see that the cyberspace is the area where you don't have really rules, and the area where a lot of military efforts are put in. And therefore, I think it is of the utmost importance to progress and to introduce regulations. And I see a strong role for a multi-stakeholder approach. Of course, the United Nations has a key role, and I wish very much to see the United Nations in the driving seat. But I think also the big tech companies, with all their resources, with all their potentials, need to be brought in addition, of course, to the states. And I think also that civil society must play an important role in the world we are living in. And this was a reason why I have accepted to join the board of ICT for Peace. This is a small organization that is very much focused on opening policy space when new issues are coming up. It's a small organization, but it's something I like very much.
Yes, indeed, Ambassador Lauber, as you know, the new permanent representative of Switzerland next to the United Nations and its offices, its agencies here in Geneva, is the chair of the open-ended working group. And so it seems like Switzerland is taking the leadership in many issues related to cybersecurity and cyber peace, and of course, big data and artificial intelligence, with the Road to Bern preparatory conferences that are leading the World Data Forum that takes place in October. So how do you see the role of Switzerland going forward on supporting what we call the Geneva Consensus, bringing stakeholders to the negotiating table?
I think Switzerland is very well positioned in playing a role, because Switzerland is not a player doing geopolitics. It's a neutral country, independent, and in many political processes, this was a major asset to move things ahead. Think, for instance, the Montreux document with private security companies Switzerland did together with the ICRC. This is an area where I think Switzerland has trust, because there is no hidden agenda. But in addition to this, Switzerland is a very well-developed country in terms of ICT knowledge. This is also a precondition that you have the technical capacity and the technical insight. And therefore, of course, I'm very much in favor of Switzerland playing an active and in future even more active role in that area. And of course, my friend Jörg Glauber, who plays an important role within the UN context, is, let's say, I'm looking with a lot of curiosity and enthusiasm to his work. I understand he's not there as the Swiss representative. It's a role that he has in the international institutions, but I really think we should move ahead there, as Switzerland was very active in the early time, for instance, of humanitarian law and humanitarian action back in the century before the last.
And I would like to finish up by talking about your book. You have a wonderful book of the culinary history of Switzerland, right? Because we know so little about it outside of Switzerland. Tell us about the book, how it came about, and the fascinating part of what we call Switzerland's soft power, right?
Yeah. There is a long relation in between diplomacy and food, diplomacy and dining. The famous British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, told that dining is the heart and the soul of diplomacy. And by this, he didn't mean that the work of a diplomat consists in eating and drinking. He wanted to say that even when eating and drinking, a diplomat has to pursue political objectives. And if you go back to the diplomatic history, creating informal spaces to move ahead negotiations is very important, because you can then convey a message you could not convey in a formal setting with note takers, with the delegations there. But I was not focusing on that aspect, on food being the environment for diplomatic efforts. Food itself can be a message. You can convey a message through food. And many countries are doing this. Turkey with the coffee culture, or Thailand with the global Thai program, with Thai restaurants. And so I was thinking, how can I use the Swiss culinary heritage to come up with messages during my time as ambassador in Switzerland? And so I tried to discover interesting stories, and I found a lot of interesting people active in the culinary area. Switzerland never had a court, so we don't have this kind of centralized food culture. But this was the reason why the most famous Swiss chefs went abroad and played a significant role in the cuisine of other countries. The most influential one was Maestro Martino, not well known, but he was the person who turned to some extent the medieval kitchen to the Renaissance kitchen in the Vatican in the time of the Renaissance. You have Caesar Ritz, who was not a chef, but he created a landscape of hotels with lavish dishes and so on. Napoleon chef Dunat was an important person, or another one, Wattel, who did cook for Ludwig, for the Sun King. Ries, also a couple of years ago, played by Gérard Depardieu in a movie. And I was looking to find this kind of persons and to tell stories around food. And of course, we also cooked. And then when I was in Washington, I met Henry Haller. I didn't know him before. He was for 5 US presidents chef in the White House, started in the Johnson days up to the Reagan area. And no other chef was so long there. And he was an interesting person. And he created for each presidential family recipes that reflected the style of the White House in that time. So the food for the common man in the Carter area, the elegant dinners in the Reagan area with the movie stars, the ranch dishes in the Johnson time, and so on. And we had many, probably hundreds of events and talks. And it's something I could each time build in messages about Switzerland, but very often also messages that link Switzerland to the United States. And then eventually I came up with the book with the recipes.
Wonderful, wonderful book. Thank you very much, Ambassador Martin Dahinden.
It was a pleasure.
And I hope à bientôt.
Bientôt, yes.
Come to Geneva sometimes then now with the ICT.
Every now and then, ICT for Peace is in Geneva, and I'm also well connected with the people, because I was also twice in Geneva posted.
Yes, you spent a great deal of time here, I understand. Thank you very much, sir. So
very much.
With you soon again. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.